The wind wasn't just blowing, it was screaming against the reinforced glass of Outpost 4, a physical weight trying to crush us. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the sharp drop in barometric pressure that always precedes a whiteout. Across the map table, Rowan watched me. Her expression was unreadable, illuminated only by the flickering lantern light, shadows cutting across her sharp cheekbones. The silence between us was louder than the gale outside. Then she asked it, the question that would dismantle everything. What do you actually want from this winter, Ranger? To understand why my answer changed everything, you have to understand the silence that came before it. 2 months ago, the silence was different. It was the silence of professional distance, cold and brittle as the ice on the eaves. I arrived at the station in a transport chopper that didn't even shut down its rotors. It just hovered long enough for me to throw my duffel onto the snowpack before banking away, leaving me in the deafening quiet of the northern Cascades. The cold hit me first, a physical blow that stole the breath from my lungs and froze the moisture in my nose instantly. Then, the heavy timber door to the cabin opened. Rowan didn't smile. She stood in the doorway, framed by the dark wood, looking less like a person and more like an extension of the mountain itself. She was efficiency personified, dressed in worn, well-oiled gear that had seen a dozen winters. She didn't ask about my flight or my background. She just pointed to the mudroom and told me to stow my gear, her voice a flat line of command. To her, I was just another piece of equipment that needed calibration, a variable to be managed in her carefully controlled ecosystem. I remember thinking that she looked like stone, impervious, weathered, and utterly unmovable. The cabin was smaller than the schematics had suggested. It was an intimate, inescapable box of cedar and stone, centered around a single cast iron wood stove that acted as the gravitational center of our universe. There was no way to move without brushing past each other, no way to exist without being hyper-aware of the other person's breathing, the rustle of their jacket, or the cadence of their steps on the floorboards. In those first few weeks, that proximity felt like a threat. I was eager to prove myself, desperate to show that I could handle the isolation. But I found myself constantly distracted by her presence. Rowan had a way of watching me that felt like a physical touch. It wasn't suspicious exactly, but it was intense. A scrutinizing, clinical observation that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd be calibrating the seismic sensors on the ridge, fingers clumsy with cold, and I'd feel her gaze on me before I even looked up. She'd be standing 10 yards back, snowshoes planted firmly, eyes narrowed behind her polarized goggles. She never offered help, just watched, assessing my efficiency, measuring my tolerance for the brutal conditions. Our routine became a grueling loop of physical exhaustion. We spent days snowshoeing the ridgelines, checking perimeter sensors, and clearing deadfall from the trails. The physical labor was immense, the kind that strips away higher thought and leaves you existing entirely in your body. My muscles burned, my lungs ached from the thin, freezing air, and yet my senses felt dialed up to an impossible frequency. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Every shift in the wind felt like a warning. The tension between us wasn't romantic then. Or at least, I didn't let myself name it that. It was the friction of authority versus autonomy, coiled tight in the small space. She was the head ranger, the veteran of 10 winters, and I was the interrupter of her solitude. We spoke in short, clipped sentences about wind speeds and snowpack density. Check the generator. Log the temperature. Don't let the fire die. But underneath the professional shorthand, there was a current running through the floorboards. I would catch her looking at my hands as I unlaced my boots, or she would hand me a mug of coffee, and our fingers would brush for a fraction of a second too long. the heat of the ceramic transferring between us like a secret code. It was a fortress of her making, and I was throwing myself against it daily, trying to find a crack. I wanted her to see me, really see me, not just as a subordinate, but as an equal in this frozen world. I wanted to crack that professional armor and see what lived underneath. But she gave me nothing but orders and silence, until the weather finally turned. The sky bruised purple and gray, the ceiling dropped, and the forecast called for a system that would seal us inside for days. The wide-open patrols were over. The true confinement was about to begin. The transition was abrupt. One day we were fighting the wind on the ridgeline, and the next, the world had shrunk to 20 by 20 feet of hewn timber and stone. The storm front had stalled over the pass, burying the trails in drifts too deep for the sleds and too unstable for snowshoes. Our perimeter, once measured in miles, was now measured in inches. The work didn't stop, but it changed. It moved inward. We shifted from the exhausting macro management of the park to the meticulous micromanagement of our survival gear. The cabin became a pressure vessel, sealing us in with nothing but the crackle of the wood stove and the humming of the backup generator. The sensory landscape of the station took over. Without the howling wind to drown everything out, the quiet inside became heavy, magnified. It was punctuated by the scratch of Rowan's fountain pen against the logbook paper, a rhythmic, deliberate sound that seemed to mark the passing of time more accurately than the clock on the wall. The air grew heavy, layered with the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil as we stripped and cleaned the service rifles, mixed with the resinous scent of cedar kindling and the dark, oily aroma of the coffee Rowan brewed. It was a thick, masculine atmosphere, warm and close, and it stripped away the ability to hide. I began to notice the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. It was different from the scrutiny on the ridge. I'd be sitting on the floor, restitching a tear in my gaiters, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across the room, and I'd feel the weight of her gaze settle on me. When I looked up, she didn't look away. Instead, her jaw would tighten slightly, a subtle physical tell of being caught. It wasn't the look of a supervisor checking on a subordinate anymore. It was the look of someone trying to solve a complex equation, calculating variables I couldn't see. The tension in the cabin forced a choreography of avoidance that was becoming impossible to maintain. I remember turning from the sink just as Rowan moved to grab a mug. We froze. The distance evaporated. I was pressed back against the counter, and she was inches away, her arm reached across my shoulder. For a second, nobody moved. I could smell the wood smoke in her hair and feel the heat radiating from her chest. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She didn't apologize, didn't make a joke to diffuse the tension. She just slowly lowered her arm, her eyes tracking the movement of my throat as I swallowed, and stepped back. The space she left behind felt cold. That evening, the dynamic shifted verbally. We were eating stew at the small map table, the storm shutters rattling softly against the rising wind outside. Rowan had the daily log open in front of her, her finger tracing my entries. Usually, this was the time for a lecture on protocol or brevity. Instead, she tapped the page. "You write like you're running out of ink," she said, her voice dropping into a register I hadn't heard before, lower, stripped of the command tone. Describing the snowpack as unforgiving isn't standard terminology, Ranger. It felt accurate, I replied, testing the waters. I didn't look at the book. I looked at her. "It is accurate," she conceded, closing the book with a soft thud. She leaned back, nursing her mug, her guard lowering just an inch. Headquarters wants numbers. They want depth charts and moisture content. They don't care that the mountain feels like it's trying to kill you. She looked at me then, a wry, tired smile touching the corner of her mouth. But I do. The last ranger I had out here treated the logs like a spreadsheet. You treat them like a diary of a shipwreck.
It was the first time she'd acknowledged me as a person rather than a function. I realized then that the fortress wasn't just about authority. It was about survival. She had been alone out here for so long that solitude had become her baseline, and my presence was a disruption she didn't know how to integrate. She wasn't cold because she didn't feel anything. She was cold because she felt everything, and the isolation was the only way she knew how to keep it in check. But the cracks were showing. The silence that followed wasn't heavy with tension. It was heavy with potential. Then the radio crackled to life, shattering the moment. The voice from base was distorted by static, but the message was clear. The system stalling over us wasn't just a storm. It was a historic event, a whiteout that was going to bury the station and sever our connection to the world completely. Rowan looked at the radio, then at me, and the softness vanished, replaced by the steel of the head ranger. But we both knew the truth now. We were about to be locked in together, and the professional distance she relied on was running out of room to hide. The storm didn't just arrive, it assaulted us. It hit with a violence that felt personal, a physical weight slamming against the timber walls until the entire cabin groaned under the pressure. The wind screamed, a high-pitched, tearing sound that vibrated in my teeth, burying the outpost under a relentless, suffocating blanket of white. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no horizon, no sky, no ground, just a swirling vortex of ice that erased everything beyond the glass. Work stopped immediately. There was no point in checking sensors that were likely buried under 10 feet of snow, and no point in logging data that wouldn't change for days. Our universe shrank instantly to the 20 by 20 foot interior of the cabin. We went into survival mode, a silent, practiced dance of securing our perimeter. I checked the window seals, pressing my hand against the freezing glass to feel for drafts, while Rowan checked the ventilation for the wood stove, ensuring the downdraft wouldn't fill the room with smoke. We were efficient, moving around each other in the tight space, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer about maintaining the park. It was about maintaining our own existence against a landscape that wanted to erase us. Then the lights flickered and died. The sudden darkness was absolute until the orange glow of the wood stove took over. In that dim light, the atmosphere shifted from professional to primal. Rowan didn't go to the breaker box. She walked straight to her personal footlocker, unlocked it, and pulled out a bottle of amber liquid. Whiskey. Top shelf. A blatant violation of the dry camp protocol she had rigorously enforced for 2 months. She didn't say a word. She just walked to the small table, set the bottle down with a heavy thud, and pulled 2 tin cups from the rack. The sound of the cork popping was shockingly loud in the quiet room. She poured 2 generous measures, the liquid glinting like oil in the firelight, and slid one across the rough wood toward me. "Medicinal," she said, her voice rough, lacking the usual command polish. "To keep the blood moving." We sat on the rug in front of the stove, the chairs feeling too formal for the sudden shift in gravity. The heat from the cast iron was intense, baking our faces, while our backs remained cool from the drafts seeping through the floorboards. I took a sip. The whiskey was smoke and fire, burning a path down my throat that mirrored the heat of the stove. Rowan held her cup in both hands, staring into the flames, her posture relaxing in a way I had never seen. Her shoulders dropped. The rigid line of her jaw softened. "Why are you here, Ranger?" she asked, not looking at me. It wasn't an interrogation this time. It was a genuine inquiry. "I wanted the quiet," I lied. Or maybe told a half-truth. I wanted to see if I could handle it. Nobody comes to the edge of the world just to see if they can stand on it, she murmured, taking a long, slow swallow of the liquor. We come here because we don't fit anywhere else. Because the noise down there makes no sense. And the noise up here, she gestured vaguely at the screaming wind. At least this noise is honest. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. The firelight caught the sharp planes of her face, softening the edges, turning her eyes into pools of dark, liquid warmth. The head ranger was gone. In her place was a woman who was tired, lonely, and achingly beautiful in the flickering light. Her guard had dropped, raw and immediate, revealing a vulnerability that pulled at my chest with a physical force. The air between us thickened, charged with the sudden, undeniable reality that we were the only two people left on Earth. The conversation lulled, the words fading away, leaving only the heavy, electric silence of two people realizing they were no longer just colleagues. And so, we arrived back at the moment that started this story, the pivot point where the world tilted on its axis. We had moved from the floor to the map table, the whiskey bottle sitting between us like a third participant in the conversation. The storm outside had ceased to be a weather event and had become a constant, screaming wall of white noise that isolated us completely from reality. In here, the only reality was the flickering lantern light, the smell of peat and wood smoke, and the woman sitting across from me. Rowan swirled the amber liquid in her tin cup, watching the vortex it created. She looked different now. The firelight had stripped away the hard lines of the commander, leaving something softer, more dangerous, exposed. She looked up, and her eyes were dark, dilated in the low light. That's when she asked it again. The question that had been hanging in the rafters since I arrived. "You're too good for this exile," she said, her voice low, vibrating through the wood of the table. "You're competent, you're smart, and you're wasting your prime years freezing in a box with a ghost. So tell me, what do you want from this winter, Ranger?" Time seemed to suspend itself. The wind outside might have stopped for all I knew. The only sound I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I knew the safe answer. The safe answer was about career advancement, about needing field hours for a transfer to a better district, about the noble pursuit of conservation. It was the answer that would keep the facade intact, the answer that would allow us to wake up tomorrow and pretend this whiskey-soaked night never happened. We could go back to the logs, the sensors, the cold, professional distance. I could stay safe. But looking at her then, seeing the way her hand gripped the cup, the tension in her shoulders that belied her relaxed posture, the way her gaze was fixed on my mouth, I realized safety was no longer an option. The pull was physical, a magnetic drag in the center of my chest that unsettled me. I took a breath, the air tasting of stale heat and ozone. "I want the truth," I said. My voice didn't shake, which surprised me. Rowan went very still. "The truth about what?" "About this," I said, gesturing vaguely to the space between us, the charged, heavy air that felt thick enough to choke on. "I want to know if you feel this pull, or if the altitude is finally getting to me. I want to know if I'm just going crazy in the snow, imagining that every time our hands brush, you freeze. Imagining that you're watching me when you think I can't see." Rowan didn't flinch. She didn't look away, didn't laugh it off, didn't retreat into her rank. She set her tin cup down on the map table with deliberate, agonizing slowness. The metal made a soft clink against the wood. She looked at me, really looked at me,
with an intensity that felt like being stripped bare. "You want the truth?" she asked, her voice dropping to a rough whisper. "The truth is, I didn't assign you to the Ridge Patrols because we needed the data. I sent you out there because I needed you out of this cabin." The admission hung in the air, stunning me. "What?" "I have been trying to exhaust you," she continued, her words tumbling out now, faster, like a dam breaking. "I have been trying to work you into the ground so that when you came back here at night, you'd be too tired to look at me. Because every time you look at me like that, Ranger, I forget that I'm your commanding officer. I forget the regulations. I forget why I came out here to be alone in the first place." She stood up then, the movement sudden and restless. She walked around the edge of the table, closing the distance between us. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. She stopped inches from me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her body, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "I tried to freeze you out," she whispered, looking down at me. "But you're still here." "I'm still here," I confirmed, standing up to meet her. The professional line didn't just blur, it evaporated. Rowan reached out, her hand hesitant for a fraction of a second before committing. Her fingers brushed my jawline, rough with calluses from the cold and the work, her thumb tracing the pulse that was fluttering wildly in my throat. Her touch was grounding, heavy, and real. "Rowan," I breathed. She didn't let me finish. She leaned in, and the first kiss wasn't tentative. It was a collision. It tasted of whiskey and wood smoke and months of suppressed hunger. It was the breaking of a storm, a release of tension so profound my knees nearly buckled. Her hand tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, anchoring me against her as the wind screamed uselessly outside. The cold, the isolation, the hierarchy, it all dissolved into the heat of her mouth on mine, a sultry, undeniable confirmation that the silence between us had never been empty. It had been full of this. The storm hadn't broken, but the fever had. I woke to the gray, diffused light of a world still buried under snow, the wind maintaining its low, rhythmic battering against the logs. But the immediate sensation wasn't the cold or the noise. It was the heavy, solid weight of an arm thrown across my waist. The reality of the night before hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was in the head ranger's bunk, tangled in the rough institutional wool blankets and the very non-institutional warmth of Rowan's body. For a long, paralyzed moment, I didn't breathe. The adrenaline of the whiskey and the confession had burned off, leaving behind the stark, unflinching clarity of the morning. I lay there staring at the timber ceiling, my heart rate spiking. This was the moment it usually falls apart. This was where the regret sets in, where the head ranger protocol snaps back into place, and I get transferred off the mountain for gross misconduct. I waited for her to pull away, to clear her throat, to start listing the regulations we had shattered. But she didn't move away. She shifted, her breathing deepening, and pulled me closer against her chest, her face buried in the curve of my neck. It was a possessive, sleepy gesture that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the truth she'd admitted to last night. When I finally woke again, the bed was empty, but the room was warm. The smell of coffee, rich, dark, and strong, cut through the stale air of the cabin. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me, feeling exposed in every sense of the word. Rowan was standing by the wood stove, feeding a log into the fire. She was wearing her thermal base layers and thick wool socks, her hair loose around her shoulders. A version of her I had never seen, soft and domestic. She turned as the latch on the stove clicked shut, and I braced myself for the speech. She didn't give one. She walked over to the bunk, handed me a steaming mug, and leaned against the bedpost, watching me over the rim of her own cup.
Her gaze was clear, steady, and unnervingly calm. "Stop thinking so loud, Ranger," she said, her voice raspy with sleep but amused. "You're vibrating." "I'm waiting for the court-martial," I admitted, wrapping my hands around the ceramic mug to stop them from shaking. "The radio is dead," she said simply, taking a sip. "The trails are buried under 10 feet of powder. As far as the Park Service is concerned, we don't exist until the plow crews can reach the access road. That gives us—" She glanced at the frosted window. 3 days. Maybe 4. And then we figure out the rest," she said, reaching out to brush a stray hair from my forehead. Her touch was firm, claiming. "But right now, the protocol is simple. We survive the storm. And we stop pretending." We established ground rules over breakfast, but they were flimsy structures built on shifting sand. We agreed that when the radio came back online, the professional hierarchy returned. We agreed that outside the cabin, she was the head ranger and I was her subordinate. But inside the 20 by 20 sanctuary of Outpost 4, the hierarchy had been leveled. The tension that had defined our first 2 months didn't disappear. It just changed polarity. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a current connecting us. The next 3 days were a blur of suspended time, a pocket universe where the only reality was the firelight and each other. We fell into a rhythm of domestic intimacy that felt dangerously natural. We read books on opposite ends of the worn leather couch, our legs tangled together under a shared quilt, communicating in a silent language of touch, a squeeze of a calf, a thumb tracing an ankle. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, filled with the scratching of turning pages and the popping of the fire. The conversations grew bolder, stripping away the last layers of professional distance. We were cleaning gear on the floor on the second night, the air thick with the smell of wax and leather. I was restringing my snowshoes, frustration mounting as the stiff rawhide refused to cooperate. Rowan watched me for a moment, then reached over, her hand covering mine, stopping my erratic movements. "You're forcing it," she said, her voice dropping into that low, sultry register that made my breath hitch. She took the lace from my fingers, her movements slow and deliberate. "You have no patience, Ranger. You treat everything like a sprint." "I get the job done," I countered, watching her hands. She looked up, a slow, teasing smile spreading across her face that made my stomach flip. "You do," she agreed. "But last night proved that sometimes slow is better. You rush the entry, you miss the nuance." My face burned, and she laughed, a genuine, throaty sound that seemed to push back the walls of the cabin. It was a joke, a tease, but it carried the weight of our new reality. We weren't just colleagues surviving a winter. We were lovers, learning the map of each other's personalities. But the mountain doesn't allow for permanent sanctuaries. On the 4th morning, the sound changed. The relentless screaming of the wind died down to a whimper, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. The gray light in the window brightened to a blinding, brilliant white. I walked to the glass and scraped away the frost. The sun was breaking over the ridge, illuminating a world that had been scrubbed clean and buried deep. The storm was over. The radio crackled with a burst of static, then a voice, distorted but audible, calling for Outpost 4. The outside world had returned, and it was demanding its rangers back. The sun was violent. After 4 days of amber firelight and shadows, the glare off the fresh powder was blinding, a brilliant, sterile white that seared the eyes even through dark lenses. We spent the first hour just digging out the shed doors, shovels ringing rhythmically against the ice. It was brutal, physical work, the kind that usually allows you to zone out, but I couldn't find that empty headspace. We moved like a team again, efficient and synchronized, tossing snow clear of the intake vents. But every time our eyes met over a snowbank, there was a shared gravity that hadn't been there a week ago.
The air between us outside felt thinner, sharper, but the magnetic pull was still there, humming under the noise of the wind. When the shed doors finally groaned open, revealing the sleek, cold shapes of the snowmobiles, Rowan slapped the cowling of her sled. "Mount up," she said. The command was back in her voice, crisp and professional. The shift was instant. I watched her pull her helmet on, obscuring her face behind the polarized visor, transforming from the woman who had held me all night into the head ranger. It was a jarring shift, like watching a door slam shut. But I saw the way her hand lingered on the throttle before she engaged the engine. She was steeling herself, too. I keyed the mic on my shoulder. "Outpost 4 to base. We are clear. Commencing perimeter sweep." The voice from base was cheerful, oblivious, crackling in my earpiece. "Copy that, 4. Glad you're still with us. Thought we lost you to the drifts for a minute there." I looked at Rowan's back as her engine roared to life, blue smoke puffing into the crisp air. They had no idea. They thought we had just been surviving the cold. They didn't know we had been burning it down. "We're here," I said, my voice steady. Proceeding to the lower basin. We rode in tandem, engines whining, carving fresh tracks into the pristine surface. We were checking the elk herds, looking for signs of winter kill or predation in the deep powder. It was technical riding, side-hilling across steep slopes, navigating buried tree wells where one wrong move means digging a 500-pound machine out of a hole. My body remembered the movements, the lean and countersteer, but my mind was splitting its focus. Half of me was the ranger, scanning for tracks. The other half was hyper-aware of the dark figure riding ahead of me. The radio chatter was constant now. Other rangers were checking in from the valley floor, discussing road closures and plow schedules. It felt surreal to hear their voices, so mundane and normal. It created a strange, thrilling dissonance. We were part of their network, using their codes, wearing their patches, but we were harboring a reality they couldn't touch. Every time Rowan answered a call, "Roger that, base. Sector 3 is clear," I felt a spike of adrenaline. It was the thrill of the secret, the knowledge that the cool, detached voice on the radio belonged to the same woman who had whispered my name in the dark. We stopped on the spine of the North Ridge to glass the canyon below. The wind was biting here, whipping snow spindrift over the edge in long, white ribbons. I was fumbling with the strap on my avalanche beacon, my fingers stiff inside my heavy gloves. "Hold still," Rowan's voice crackled in my earpiece. She walked over, effectively blocking the wind with her body. She didn't take her gloves off. It was too cold for that. Instead, she reached out, her leather-clad hands manipulating the buckles on my chest rig with practiced ease. It was a standard safety check. Any ranger would do it for another. But the way she did it, she pulled the strap tight, the friction of leather on nylon loud in the silence. Then, her hands lingered, just for a second. Her palms pressed flat against the front of my jacket, right over my heart. Through the layers of Gore-Tex and fleece, I couldn't feel the warmth of her skin, but I felt the pressure. I felt the intent. She leaned in, her helmet bumping mine with a soft clack. "Your gear is loose, Ranger," she said over the comms, her voice devoid of emotion for anyone listening on the channel. But I could see her eyes behind the visor, dark and amused. "Copy that," I managed to say, my voice tight. She stepped back, the loss of her proximity immediate and sharp. "Don't let it happen again." I watched her walk back to her sled, the confident, predatory grace of her movement unchanged by the bulky gear. I realized then that the secrecy didn't diminish the connection. It pressurized it. Every stolen glance, every coded sentence, every professional touch that lasted a microsecond too long carried more voltage than a blatant caress. The public mask didn't hide the heat. It contained it, turning us into a walking
bomb. We were dangerous now, not because of the terrain, but because of what we were hiding. I was still watching her when the radio cut through the static with a tone we rarely heard. It wasn't the casual chatter of the plow crews. It was the sharp, three-tone alert of an emergency transmission. All units, we have a distress beacon activation in Sector 7. High-angle terrain, possible skier-triggered slide. Sector 7, the canyon. The most unstable, treacherous ground in the district. Rowan froze, her hand hovering over her throttle. The game was over. The secret was stowed. The storm was calling, and this time, it wasn't asking for our attention. It was demanding a sacrifice. Sector 7 is a geological mistake. It's a narrow, jagged throat of granite where the wind accelerates to hurricane force, and the snowpack rarely bonds to the rock. We abandoned the sleds at the rim, the engines ticking as they cooled in the biting air, and moved to the edge on foot. The world here was vertical, a dizzying drop into a bowl of white shadows. Through the binoculars, I spotted him, a flash of neon orange against the monochrome gray and white. A skier, off-piste and out of luck, clinging to a precarious outcropping of rock halfway down the chute. Rowan took command instantly. The shift was absolute. The lover who had teased me about my impatience was gone. The head ranger was back, and she was intensely focused. She assessed the slope, the wind, the dying light. "Snow is rotten," she barked over the wind, her voice distorted by the comms but clear in intent. "It's sugar on top of ice. If we both go down, we trigger a slide that buries us all. I'll set the anchor. You're on the line." It was the right call, the only call, but it knotted my stomach. I would be the weight, she would be the counterbalance. I clipped into the harness, the metallic snap of the carabiner sounding impossibly loud in the thin air. Rowan checked my knots, her hands moving with brutal efficiency. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the gear. She yanked the webbing tight, tighter than necessary, and for a split second, her hand rested on my shoulder, a heavy, hard press. "Don't be a hero," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Just be fast." I went over the edge. The transition from standing to hanging is always jarring, a sudden surrender to gravity that your brain screams against. I rappelled down, my crampons seeking purchase on the ice-slicked granite. The wind down in the chute was violent, buffeting me against the rock face, trying to peel me off the mountain. Every 10 feet, I radioed my status. "Movement steady. Snow is unstable. Watch the slack." "Copy." Rowan's voice was in my ear, a steady, monotone anchor in the chaos. "I have you. Keep moving." I reached the skier. He was panicked, shivering violently, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He grabbed at me, his desperation making him dangerous. "Easy," I shouted, fighting to stabilize us both on a ledge the size of a dinner plate. "I've got you. We're going up." I worked frantically to secure him to the rescue harness, my fingers numb and clumsy. The snow beneath my boots groaned, a deep, settling sound that every ranger knows in their bones. It was the sound of the mountain exhaling. "Structure is failing," I yelled into the mic. "I'm loading him now. Tension! Give me tension!" The line went taut. I pushed off the rock to guide the basket up, but as I shifted my weight, the ledge disintegrated. The snow didn't just slide, it shattered. The ground vanished from under my boots. I fell, the world blurring into a wash of white and gray. I waited for the stomach-churning sensation of freefall, for the inevitable impact. The rope snapped tight. It jerked me to a halt with a violence that knocked the wind out of me, leaving me dangling over 300 feet of nothing. I swung wildly, slamming into the rock face, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Sarah!" The name tore through the radio static.
It wasn't ranger. It wasn't a code. It was a scream, raw and terrified, stripped of every layer of professional armor she possessed. Hearing my name, spoken with that level of panic by the woman who was supposed to be stone, shook me more than the fall. "I'm here," I wheezed, tasting blood where I'd bitten my lip. "I'm holding. The anchor. Does it hold?" There was a pause, a shaky breath over the open channel. "I have you," she said, and her voice was trembling. "I have you. I am not letting go. Climb." The extraction was a blur of adrenaline and muscle failure. We hauled the skier up, inch by agonizing inch. But I wasn't focused on him. I was focused on the rope, the thin, synthetic lifeline that connected me to the woman at the top. I could feel her on the other end, feel the strain in the line as she fought the physics of the mountain to keep me safe. When I finally flopped over the rim, exhausted and shaking, I didn't look at the victim. I looked at Rowan. She was on her knees in the snow, the anchor line wrapped around her body like a second skin. Her face was pale, her goggles pushed up, and her eyes were wide, dark holes of fear. She stared at me, checking for broken bones, for blood, for life. For a second, in front of the shivering skier and the indifferent sky, she looked like she was going to shatter. Then she blinked. The mask slammed back down, and she stood up. "Secure the victim," she ordered, her voice flat and hard as iron. "We move out in 5. The ride back to the cabin was done in silence. The sun had set, plunging the world back into blue shadows. I followed her taillights, the red glow blurring in my vision. My body ached, bruised and battered, but the cold settling in my chest had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the echo of her scream in my ear. We had survived the storm, and we had survived the slide, but I wasn't sure we would survive the terrifying realization of how much we suddenly had to lose. The adrenaline crashed, leaving me hollowed out, and as the dark shape of the cabin appeared in the distance, I knew the protocol was gone for good. We weren't rangers anymore. We were just two people who had almost watched the other die. The heavy timber door slammed shut behind us, sealing the mountain out. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was ringing, vibrant with the phantom echo of the wind and the terrifying memory of the fall. The cabin was warm, the air thick with the scent of the pine resin we'd thrown on the fire before leaving, but I couldn't stop shivering. It was a deep, bone-rattling tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the adrenaline crash. I stood in the center of the room, water dripping from my gear onto the floorboards, unable to make my hands work the buckles of my harness. Rowan didn't wait. She didn't ask for a status report. She crossed the room in 2 strides, stripping off her gloves and throwing them onto the map table. She stopped in front of me, her breathing still ragged, and her hands were on me instantly. But this wasn't the slow, testing touch of the storm nights. This was frantic, desperate. She worked the clips of my harness, her fingers fumbling slightly, a loss of dexterity that betrayed her composure. The heavy nylon webbing fell away with a clatter. She unzipped my jacket, peeling the frozen Gore-Tex layers off me like she was searching for damage, checking for broken parts. "Sit," she ordered. It wasn't a request, but the command lacked the steel of the head ranger. It was brittle, cracking around the edges. I sat on the edge of the hearth, the stone radiating heat against my legs. I watched as she moved to the kitchenette, filling a basin with hot water from the kettle, grabbing the first aid kit. Her movements were jerky, too fast. She was trying to outrun the panic that was clearly still nipping at her heels. When she returned, she knelt between my knees, dipping a cloth into the steaming water. "Give me your hand," she said. I held it out. The rope burn was angry and red, a raw line across my palm where the line had bitten through the glove during the arrest. She took my wrist, her grip firm, grounding. As she dabbed the cloth against the wound, the sting was sharp and immediate, pulling a hiss of breath through my teeth. Rowan flinched as if she were the one feeling it. She paused, the cloth hovering over my skin, and for the first time since we'd entered the cabin, she looked up at my face. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with red, stripped of every defense she had spent 10 years building. "You fell," she whispered. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of horror. "I slipped," I corrected gently. "The anchor held. You held." "I heard you scream," she said, her voice trembling. "I have been on this mountain for a decade. I have pulled bodies out of that canyon. I have never felt that." She dropped the cloth into the basin, the water turning pink. She gripped my knees, her fingers digging into the fabric of my thermal pants. "When the line went slack, Sarah, for a second, you were just gone. And the only thing I could think was that I was going to have to go down there and find you broken." "But I'm not broken," I said, reaching out to touch her face. Her skin was cold from the ride, her cheekbones sharp under my palm. "I'm right here." "That's the problem," she said, leaning into my touch, her eyes closing. "You're right here, and I can't do this. I can't be the head ranger who calculates risk ratios and sends people into the chute, and also be the woman who can't breathe because you're on the other end of the rope. I lost control today. I screamed your name on an open channel. I compromised the mission because I was terrified." "You saved the mission," I argued softly. "You pulled us both up." "I pulled you up," she corrected, her eyes snapping open, fierce and possessive. I didn't give a damn about the skier. I didn't care about the protocol. I pulled you up because the thought of letting you fall broke me. She moved her hands up my thighs to my waist, pulling me forward until our foreheads rested together. The scent of her, sweat and fear and cold air, filled my lungs. I own this fear now. It's mine. And I hate it because it means I have something to lose. The admission hung in the air, heavy and sultry. It was a declaration of ownership that went deeper than any physical intimacy. She was admitting that I had breached the last fortification. The isolation wasn't enough to protect her anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," I promised, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "You don't get to," she murmured against my mouth. "You don't get to die on me. That is a direct order." We didn't have the energy for anything more. The adrenaline had hollowed us out, leaving us raw and exhausted. We stumbled to the bunk, not bothering to separate into our own spaces. We collapsed together, still wearing half our base layers, tangled in the wool blankets. We didn't touch in a sexual way. We touched to confirm existence. Her arm was heavy across my chest, pinning me to the mattress, her leg hooked over mine. As the fire died down to embers, casting a dull red glow across the room, I listened to her breathing even out, shifting from the jagged rhythm of panic to the slow, deep cadence of sleep. But even in sleep, her grip on me didn't loosen. We were alive. We were together. And the mountain outside, for tonight, had failed to take what we had found. Spring broke the mountain's back. It didn't arrive gently. It was a chaotic, noisy unraveling. The profound, ringing silence we had lived in for months was shattered by the relentless, percussive rhythm of meltwater. The roof dripped, the eaves ran, and the creek below the cabin roared back to life, tearing through the ice dams. The pristine white fortress of Outpost 4 revealed itself to be just wood and stone again, stained by the season. The air grew thick, smelling of wet earth, pine sap, and the rot of old leaves uncovering themselves from the drifts. It was messy and loud, the opposite of the clean, suspended reality we had built. With the thaw came the world. The printer, silent since the power failure, stuttered to life one morning, spitting out the transfer manifests. The winter rotation was ending. The bureaucracy was reasserting its gravity. I was slated for the coastal district, 1,000 miles away. Rowan was to remain here, the eternal guardian of the pass. The paper sat on the map table between us, a bureaucratic wedge driven right into the center of our breakfast. The question that hadn't been asked all winter suddenly filled the room, suffocating us. Was this just a fever dream born of isolation? Does what happens in a whiteout survive the sun? I watched her read the orders, terrified that the head ranger mask was about to slide back into place, sealing her away from me. We took one last patrol to the boundary line. The snowmobiles were useless in the mud, so we hiked, boots sinking into the heavy slush. The physical labor was different now, slogging, wet, sweating in the warmer air. We stopped at the overlook where the snow had pulled back to reveal the gray granite spine of the ridge. Rowan stood looking out at the valley turning green below, her profile sharp against the blue sky. She looked like she belonged to the mountain again, distant and untouchable, already recalibrating for the solitude. I had to know. I walked up beside her, mimicking the stance we'd held that first night in the storm. "You asked me a question once," I said, my voice feeling too loud in the open air. "You asked what I wanted from the winter." Rowan turned, her eyes shielded by dark glasses, but I could feel the weight of her gaze. "I remember." "So I'm asking you," I pressed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The snow is gone. The road is open. What do you want from the spring, Rowan?" She was silent for a long time. She looked at the valley, then at the station far below, then finally at me. She took off her glasses, and the vulnerability was still there, terrified, but present. "I want the truth," she echoed, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "And the truth is, I'm done with the quiet. I've spent 10 years convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that the solitude was a strength. But looking at this view without you, it just looks empty." She reached out, her hand finding mine, ignoring the risk of being seen from the trail. "I'm putting in for a transfer, partner status. It's a career risk. They might separate us. They might fire us. But I'm not staying in that cabin alone. Not anymore." We locked the cabin door 3 days later. The sound of the heavy iron key turning in the lock felt final, a punctuation mark on the life we were leaving behind. We walked down the trail toward the waiting truck, leaving the safety of the isolation for the danger of the real world. I had asked for the truth, and it had cost us our sanctuary, but it had given us everything else. If you've ever risked a safe career for a dangerous truth, subscribe to hear where the next patrol takes us.